Welcome to Module 1. I'm glad you made it. So let's get started right away. In this module, we will talk about the origins and the history of yoga. We will get an overview of the scriptures on which the philosophical concepts of yoga are based, and we will try to understand not only what the Vedas are or where they came from, but also the mindset of the people who considered them important. Because I believe if we really want to understand any concept fully, we have to look at it through the eyes of the people who gave it to us in the first place. We will also try to understand why they were written down and what makes them important for us still today. We will also talk about the development of yoga all the way into our modern days so that you have a really good understanding of how these changes happened and why they might be important to understanding your own practice. There's a document attached to this module which you can read in a little more detail. And if you want to dive in even more, I've added a list of suggested books and other resources to it. There's also a free course available at the moment offered by Harvard University that is called Hinduism Through Its Scriptures that you can take online in case you want to learn even more. There are many amazing resources available. I've also attached some suggested practices for reflection that you can use to integrate each lesson more into your own life. And maybe in that way, you can understand it on an even deeper level. I really recommend you don't skip this part of the course. And I also really recommend using a journal to write these reflections down and use a journal in general for your own reflection in general. And also, on top of that, if you happen to have good friends to talk philosophy over a cup of coffee with, then that's great. Please do that too. And please join our Facebook group where you can post questions and discuss things with other people. And of course, your physical asana practice is important too. Some of you might already have a practice. Some of you are starting from scratch, but either way, I recommend using the practice videos from the beginning and move through them in your own pace. But most importantly, enjoy the lesson. So let's begin with Module 1. What is yoga? Where does it come from? Where or when did it originate? And what are its roots? Well, the roots are really difficult to trace, especially if we don't have an understanding of the nature of time. What even is history? What is time? Before we even begin to talk about any origins or history of yoga, we need to understand what history actually means in the Vedic sense. So let's talk about the Vedic concept of time for a moment. Time is determined by the stars. One rotation of the Earth gives us 1 day. One orbit around the sun gives us 1 year. One moon cycle is a month. So we know that time is not linear and doesn't have a beginning and an end. Like the movement of the stars, it is cyclical. It repeats over and over again, not in exactly the same way, of course, but in its essence, it gives us a continuum of seasons, phases of night and day, tidal ebbs and flow, different climates, and so on. And of course, it doesn't stop there. There is, of course, so much more to the movement of the stars than just the ones we are aware of in our daily lives. For one, there are also bigger cycles, like the rotation of our solar system around the galactic center, which takes about 230 million years. And there is the precession of the equinoxes, which has a cycle of about 25 or 26,000 years. There's the contraction and expansion of the universe, and the universe is much more vast and endless as we can even begin to think. The Vedas describe an orbit of the sun, of our sun, around a dark star or a pole star, which takes about 24,000 years, according to one particular set of calculations that I'm using here, published by Sri Yukteswar in a book called The Holy Silence, which was published in 1894. 12,000, or half of these 24,000 years, are spent ascending or moving closer to the dark star or to the galactic center, and the other half is spent descending or slowly moving away again. And then, of course, the incredible energy that is released by the stars and their movement doesn't only influence the physical matter like climate and seasons, but also our consciousness. This image is a computer image of a galaxy similar to our Milky Way. If you look at this image and imagine that somewhere inside of this churning ocean of energy, tiny, completely drowned in it and invisible, is our solar system, our sun, our earth, and ourselves. We are literally bathing in these incredible, powerful, and fluctuating energies. And it is only logical to me that our minds are completely influenced by them too. We all know that the more centered we are in ourselves, the more aware, happy, and enlightened we become. And according to the Vedic concept of time, as described in the Puranas, the closer we are to the galactic center, which is described as the dark star, the higher and more enlightened is the level of our collective consciousness. And the further away we are, the more dull and ignorant we become, and the less aware and refined our intelligence will be. We can't help it. After all, we are only a reflection of the forces of the universe. The Vedic scriptures divide these 12,000 ascending and 12,000 descending years into 4 phases or eras called the 4 Yugas. Satya Yuga is the age of truth. It is the era of the closest proximity to the center and our highest stages of enlightenment for all of humanity. People of this age would very likely have been most happy and lived in harmony with nature and the world around them. They were more evolved than we are now. And by evolved, I mean happier and more enlightened rather than technically evolved. There probably wasn't much greed or grasping to the material as there is today. In fact, I think people may have lived much simpler, longer, and healthier lives and spent their time with things like art and music and beautiful things that were in line with their respect for nature. According to the holy science, the last Satya Yuga would have happened in approximately 11,500 BC, and it would have lasted for about 4,800 years, which makes it the longest of the eras of the Yugas. The next phase then was Treta Yuga, which lasted about 3,600 years. It was called Treta Yuga because consciousness was considered to have been diminished by 1/3. People started to feel more dull than before and less able to comprehend the higher mysteries of life and the universe and become more fearful. And so their actions would have become slowly but surely more self-serving and self-centered than before. And after that began Dwapara Yuga, which lasted about 2,400 years, where consciousness was diminished by half. During this time, there was no more direct experience of the higher universal truths. And so people started to distrust their own intuitive wisdom and began to rely only on reason and logic. The written word probably started to come into as people's minds degraded and they needed more tools for memorizing things. After that came the last and darkest of the ages, Kali Yuga, the age of destruction. This is the darkest of all ages where people lost the capacity to comprehend almost all matters of subtle energy and higher concepts, and only concepts of gross matter and material things could be grasped. And because of that, fear was probably ruling a lot of our action. According to Sri Yukteswar's calculation, the last Kali Yuga happened not too long ago at all. It lasted for 1,200 years descending, and then another 1,200 years ascending, moving closer again to the center. So its darkest, most ignorant point of humanity, according to these calculations, happened around 500 AD. So our Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, with all their book burning and women burning and torture chambers and religious corruptions and so on. But the good news is that since the year 1700, we would have entered Dwapara Yuga again. Sri Yukteswar tells us about a 200-year period of transition on either end of each yuga, which means that since the year 1900, we should be fully at the very beginning of ascending Dwapara Yuga again. We're once again beginning to understand concepts beyond matter, like energy, electricity, prana, chi, and so on. And we will continue to open our minds more and more and eventually rise up again to the awareness of Treta Yuga and to the full or almost fully enlightened stages of Satya Yuga. I think it's quite a nice thought to know that even though we are still thousands of years away from Satya Yuga and by no means enlightened or even capable of enlightenment, maybe, at least not for most of us, we are still on the rise again, increasing our awareness and intelligence and moving closer toward our center, our cosmic self. Even though things are far from perfect, they are getting better all the time. And these cycles repeat over and over again, smaller cycles within larger cycles, each time expressing slightly different aspects of consciousness and life, and so on, endlessly, without any beginning or end. So now, with this understanding of time and history from the Vedic perspective of consciousness, we can maybe understand that the teachings of the Vedas may have come from a time where humanity as a whole was a lot more enlightened than we are now, and that the messages the people of these ages are giving us are hugely important messages that really help us to understand the truth of our own nature and of the universe and life itself. Things we otherwise can't easily understand, especially not with our Kali and Dwapara Yuga minds. And with this understanding, let's look a little bit closer at what these messages are and where they were found. So the written scriptures that are form the basis of the concepts of yoga are called the Vedas. Veda is a Sanskrit word and means knowledge. And as you can imagine by now, it refers to not just any knowledge, but to the deep mystical knowledge about life and about the universe and about the enlightened stages of consciousness and about our own true nature and destiny that was passed on through the Yugas. The Vedas were transmitted orally for a long time in form of chanting before they were finally written down. And maybe the decline of the powers of human minds were forcing people to invent the written word, as we couldn't remember things so easily anymore. This happened during a time called the Vedic Age, between about 1500 BC to 500 AD, just after the decline of the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization in India and Pakistan. The Indus Valley civilization was a really interesting period of history where we can already understand the level of consciousness of the last higher stages of Dwapara Yuga and the remains of Treta Yuga. During this age, women, for example, played a very central role in society and were really well respected. The feminine and masculine principles were considered equal. Gods and goddesses were equally worshipped. And there was a holistic understanding of nature and the universe. And when we talk about gods and goddesses, we have to be careful not to confuse this with the meaning of religion in our more recent times. We have to remember that during the higher stages of human consciousness, it wouldn't have been a matter of following any personalized image blindly and sticking to any book of rules without true understanding. It was more a case of refined awareness toward the cosmic intelligence and consciousness that pervades everything in nature. And so, yes, of course, with this in mind, things like the sun or the moon or fire or the wind were not things at all, but conscious beings full of power and intelligence, and their energy could be felt and understood and communicated with. It was a direct experience of these intelligent forces of nature. The Vedas were written down over a period of about 2,000 years. during the descending Dwapara and Kali Yuga. Writing them down was needed at that time to hold on to the higher knowledge of the previous ages. So let's look at the Vedas. The oldest of the Vedas to be written down was the Rig Veda. Rig means praise in Sanskrit. The Rig Veda contains more than 1,028 mantras, praising the natural forces of the universe, like fire or the sun or the fundamental energy or particles that is the basis of all life. The deeper message of these mantras is that all of life and all of nature is consciousness, and that there is an inherent cosmic intelligence, a divine spark in everything, and that we are all connected, dependent on these intelligent divine forces of nature. Fire, air, water, earth, the sun, the concept of time itself, the powers of the universe, and of the smallest particles are described in ways that teach us that we have to respect these forces, acknowledge them, and respect them. They teach us that everything is alive and therefore conscious and divine. We all understand that to nourish, for example, any kind of friendship or relationship we have to give things, we have to give our attention, we have to respect the other person, we have to help them when they need help, and sometimes we have to celebrate them and give them a gift or a compliment. This is how friendships are nourished and treated, and this is important, because if we didn't do this, there would not be a relationship or a friendship. There would be a disconnect. And the people of the higher yugas knew this to be true, not only with their fellow human beings, but with all of life. That's why performing rituals was considered so important. It is our way of giving to the cosmic forces to show that we care, to nourish the relationship. And not only because the rituals were not performed only in hope to get something out of it, or to use these forces for our own good, but for the pure sake of living in friendship and harmony with the whole world. So at the end of this document, there's a link that will bring you to a free PDF download of the Rig Veda in case you're curious. And also you can get an audio download on Audible, which is very nice. The Sama Veda is very similar to the Rig Veda, except that more emphasis is given to tonation and vocal expression. And I've heard it say that it is the Rig Veda put to music. Sound and music was, of course, more important and valued than it is now, although I do think that deep down we still understand the incredible healing powers of sound vibration through our craving for listening to music we all have. And especially the sounds of Sanskrit are said to be powerfully healing. We'll talk a little bit more about Sanskrit in a while. The Ayurveda describes important rituals and sacrifices to be given to the forces of nature. As we understand now, it was considered very important to show respect to all of life, especially the deeper forces of nature and the cosmos. It was considered essential common courtesy to express gratitude and respect to all things like the sun, the moon, fire, water, not just humans. A relationship was upheld with the clouds and the rain, and people believed that they could truly communicate with these powers of nature. And of course, much of this was done through ritual and sacrifice. Rituals and sacrifice changed a lot in their nature through the descending Kali Yuga, where they were much more fear-based and centered around personal gain. And then the last of the four Vedas is the Atharva Veda, which was composed quite a bit later than the previous three. And its content is quite different too. Already in the descending Kali Yuga, the needs of the people had already changed and become more materialistic and based on personal needs and survival. The text concerns itself much more with procedures for everyday life, which is what Atharva means. It has a much more self-serving quality than the previous Vedas that were about giving and connecting to higher universal energies. Ayurveda, for example, is a medical science that has come out of the Atharva Veda. We'll talk about Ayurveda more later in the course. All of the Vedas were written quite poetically in short verses and mantras with no explanations to any of the deeper philosophical concepts. And so they can be difficult to understand. To make them easier to understand, the Upanishads were written to accompany them as commentaries. The Upanishads are really beautifully written commentaries on the Vedas, usually in form of a dialogue between two people, like a teacher and a student. And there are translations, of course, available too, that are profound and quite easy to read. And I've included a version in my list of suggested reading at the end of the module, in case you are curious and would like to read more. All of these texts are considered to be received by divine inspiration by the authors. They are, although they have been written down, the authors have not invented these things, but they are universal truths that have been passed down through the ages, orally first, before they were written down. And they are said to have no human origin at all. They're said to have originated by the gods themselves. Or in other words, their knowledge is, the knowledge of the Vedas is considered cosmic laws that has been received as divine intuition from the forces of the cosmos and of nature. And that's why they are referred to as Shruti, which means that which is heard, as in that which is received. By contrast, Smrti, or that which is remembered, are texts that have been defined by rishis, by the seers or the wise people of ancient India. They have been authored, invented, and defined by actual human beings, wise human beings, but still human. These texts include the Dharma Shastras, which describe laws and morals and codes of behavior. And some of them actually are quite controversial because they contain descriptions of the caste systems in India, and they're said to have caused a lot of the ostracizing treatment of the lower castes and of women in India. The Itihasa are stories that were used for teaching purposes. The most famous ones are the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Both of them are really beautiful stories and well worth reading. And I think the Mahabharata may actually be one of the best stories ever written. And it's beautiful to read. It reads like a very long, but a very profound and well-written Indian soap opera, or like an epic, just like Homer's Odyssey, only even richer and more colorful. The Mahabharata tells the story of 5 brothers and their fight for justice. It's so rich and full of mythologies and subplots, and it actually counts as the longest story in the world, with over 100,000 verses in the original. And again, I've included a suggestion for a beautiful interpretation of it in the documents in the end, and it is also available on Audible. In one part of the story, Arjuna, who is one of the main characters, rides in his chariot toward a battlefield where he is about to fight his own cousins. He starts on the way to doubt what he's about to do, and he stops and he asks Krishna, who is his charioteer, for advice. And Krishna, who is not only his charioteer, but also in the story an avatar of Vishnu, goes into a talk about yoga. This dialogue between them becomes a book, has become a book in its own right. It's called the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita is an important text on yoga, of course, because it is all about yoga. So we will talk about this a little bit more later on in the course. And then the Puranas The Puranas are a collection of mythologies, and they cover many subjects like cosmology, the creation of the universe, the nature of time, the nature of cosmic forces, deities, stars, planets, and so on. The concept of the Yugas is contained in them too. They tell stories about Brahma and his four heads that grew from him as he turns his head around in attraction to a woman who circles around him. It reads just like a description of an atom with its protons and electrons. Some of the stories talk about how Shiva split from a man-woman into a man and a woman, creating gender and duality. And others talk about the churning of the milk ocean, which created all living things. And in my imagination, the milk ocean looks much like the Milky Way. In any case, if you are interested in mythology and creation stories in general, you will find this to be a real treasure. And I've included some suggested reading again for you in the end. The Vedangas are the 6 limbs of the Veda, the 6 branches of the Vedas. They were actually considered to be important to study before even getting to the Vedas or the Upanishads. All of the Vedic texts were written in Sanskrit, and to understand them, it was necessary to study things like grammar, meter, phonetics, and etymology first. To understand the texts about rituals, the nature of rituals first had to be studied too. And to understand concepts, things like the concept of time and other cosmic energies, as we've already got a small glimpse about when we were talking about the Yugas, the study of Jyotish, which means the study of light, was necessary too. And finally, just a little word on the language of Sanskrit. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten of course, there were the classical texts as well on the specific subjects like Ayurvedic texts and the sutras and shastras of the different schools of Indian philosophy, and one of them is yoga. And we will find out all about this in the next module. And yes, and then, of course, yes, and then let's talk about Sanskrit for a moment, because all of these texts were written in Sanskrit. Sanskrit was the language of the Vedic times, and it is one of the oldest languages in the world, maybe even the oldest that is still around today. And what's so special about Sanskrit is that it has evolved during a time of high consciousness and a great understanding and awareness of, especially of sound and vibration. Each sound, each word, and each syllable actually matches the vibration of the thing it intends to describe. Also, it is virtually limitless in the number of words that it can create. Its grammar is considered so perfect that it hasn't changed since the days it was still spoken. And even NASA has said that it was the most intelligent language there is and most suited for any kind of use for their artificial intelligence programming. So to illustrate a little bit, the Sanskrit alphabet consists of 52 letters divided into the different kinds of sounds and where in the mouth these sounds are produced. The vowels, for example, are divided into 5 groups. The guttural sounds that are produced at the back of the throat, the cerebral sounds that are produced at the soft palate, the palatal sounds, the dental sounds, and the labial sounds from the lips. Now, to give an example for the importance of the language as a symbol for energy and vibration, if you use only the simplest of all sounds, the simplest of all vowels, the pure sound that underlies all other sounds, the first sound that can be produced in the mouth all the way back in the throat, a guttural sound. It sounds like ah. If you use that primal sound and you push this sound through all the possible places in your mouth, from the guttural all the way to the labial, So you do that really by uttering the sound and then very slowly closing the mouth, pushing the sound through all these places. It goes through all of the potential sound that creates the basis for all other sound. It is the sound that holds the potential of everything else, of everything in existence. It's the foundation of every possible word or thing that could be described. It sounds like this. So out of the sound of Om, all other sounds could be produced. And so it stands for the creative potential of all of the universe. If the whole universe had a sound, it would be Om. To chant Om and to feel its vibration deep inside your body, in your cells, is considered to connect us with the potentiality of the whole universe and also with your own creative divine potential. It is as if chanting, letting its vibrations sink into your body cells, it lets our cells remember their own true nature. So this is just one example, but also all other sounds and words are meant to directly correspond to the vibration of the things they describe. This is why chanting in Sanskrit is considered healing and why using the Sanskrit terminology is considered quite important in yoga. And of course, again, there's a link to a blog post at the end of the lesson in case you're interested to read a little bit more. So now we are getting to the 6 points of view in Indian philosophy. So around the start of our common era, all of the knowledge that came from the Vedic texts were categorized and divided into 6 different viewpoints, or darshana. Those viewpoints aren't in any opposition to one another. They don't contradict one another. They just show different angles and different aspects of the same truth. For example, the philosophy of Nyaya was founded by Gautama Rishi, and it focuses on correct knowledge or what is the best way to find it. Basically, it is a study of how to conduct research. It explores all the rules and laws of the universe based simply on logic and methodology. Vaisheshika is practically a sister school to Nyaya, and actually all 6 schools are pretty much paired up into one of them based on theory and the other based on the practical application of that theory. So the practical partner school of Nyaya, Vaisheshika, applies this logic and rules of research to explore the natural world. It is a science of the natural world. And it even contains one of the earliest descriptions of small particles and atoms. Then the next one is Samkhya or Sankhya, sometimes also called, which was founded by Kapila. Samkhya is a dualistic metaphysical philosophy, and it describes the universe as born from 2 opposing dualistic forces, consciousness and matter. It is also a psychology of the human mind and of its conscious evolution. This is the one school of thought that is going to be most important to us in our yoga study. It literally forms the basis of yoga and also of Ayurveda. And for this reason, we will have a whole lesson dedicated to it. So for now, just know that it provides the theory on which all yogic practices are based. So yoga, of course, provides then the practical application of this knowledge. And it is the practical path to liberation of our consciousness, a step-by-step approach to perfecting the mind and to return back to our innate, divine, perfectly balanced and awake state of being. And of course, we will find out much more about this in the coming lessons. Mimamsa is the sister school to Vedanta, and the 2 of them were later merged together into one. And it deals with the reflecting on the knowledge and on the knowledge from the Vedas and how to implement it in life. which is called Dharma or righteous living. And then Vedanta means the end of the Vedas, and it summarizes all of the teachings of the Vedas, just like the Upanishads, which are part of it, and also the Bhagavad Gita, which is, of course, also important to our study of yoga. Vedanta is not dualistic, and we will also look at it a little bit closer later on in the course. So for now, we will finish the first video here. So I hope you found this interesting so far. And now that you have a little bit more of an idea of where yoga came from, in the next video, we will look at it more closely to see how it came to be the kind of yoga you and I are practicing on our mats. And if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Facebook group or email me. So I'll see you in the next part.